Chapter 24 The Temple Legend. The Temple Legend is a name that I give to that legend or tradition which traces the origin of Freemasonry as an organized institution to the Temple of Solomon and to the builders, Jewish and Tyrian, who were employed in the construction of that edifice. This is the legend that is now almost universally accepted by the great mass of the Masonic fraternity. Perhaps 9 out of 10 of the Freemasons of the present day, that is to say, all those who receive tradition with the undoubting faith that should be given to history only, conscientiously believe that Freemasonry, as we now see it, organized into lodges and degrees, with grand masters, masters, and wardens, with the same ritual observances, was first devised by Solomon, king of Israel, and assumed its position as a secret society during the period when that monarch was engaged in the construction of the temple on Mount Moriah. Footnote. In a sermon by the Reverend A.N. Keigwin at the dedication of the Masonic Temple in Philadelphia, 1873, we find the following passage. Historically, Masonry dates from the building of the Temple of Solomon. No one at the present day disputes this claim. I cite this out of hundreds of similar passages in other writers to show how universal among such educated Masons is the belief in the temple theory. It is, in fact, very true that only those scholars who have made the history of the order an especial study have any doubt upon the subject. This theory is not a new one. It was probably at first suggested by the passage in the Legend of the Craft, which briefly describes the building of the temple, and the confirmation by Solomon of the charges which his father David had given to the Masons. There can be no doubt from this passage in the legend that the Temple of Solomon occupied a prominent place in the ideas of the medieval Masons. How much use they made of it in their esoteric ceremonies, we, of course, are unable to learn. It is, however, a significant coincidence, if nothing more, that there was a somewhat similar legend among the Compagnons de la Tour, those mystical associations of workmen who sprang up in France about the 12th century and who are supposed to have been an offshoot of dissatisfied journeymen from the body of oppressive masters who at that period constituted the ruling power of the corporate guilds of operative masons and other crafts. As the traditions of this society in reference to the Temple of Solomon are calculated to throw much light on the ideas which prevailed among the Masons in respect to the same subject, and as the temple legends of the Compagnons are better known to us than those of the medieval operative Masons, and finally, as it is not at all unlikely that the ideas of the former were derived from those of the latter, it will not be inexpedient to take a brief view of the temple legend of the Compagnonage. The Compagnons de la Tour have 3 different legends, each of which traces the association back to the Temple of Solomon through three different founders, which causes the compagnonage to be divided into three distinct and, unfortunately, hostile associations. These are the children of Solomon, the children of Pt.I, Jacques, and the children of Pt.I Subis. The children of Solomon assert that they were associated into a brotherhood by King Solomon himself at the building of the temple. The children of Pt.I Jacques and those of Pt.I Subis declare that both of these workmen were employed at the temple, and after its completion went together to Gaul, where they taught the arts which they had learned in Jerusalem. Footnote. The reader will remember the story in the legend of the craft of one Namus Gracchus, who came from Jerusalem and from the temple in the time of Charles Martel and propagated Masonry in France. The tradition of Pt.I Jacques is particularly interesting. He is said to have been the son of a celebrated architect named Jacquin, who was one of the chief masters of Solomon and a colleague of Hiram Abiff. From the age of 15, he was employed as a stone cutter. He traveled through Greece, where he acquired a knowledge of architecture and sculpture. He then went to Egypt and thence to Jerusalem, where, being engaged in the construction of the temple, he fabricated 2 pillars with such consummate skill that he was at once received as a master of the craft. It is not necessary to pursue the legend of the French compagnonage any further. Sufficient has been told to show that they traced their origin to the Temple of Solomon, and that the legend referred to events connected with that edifice. Now, as these traveling journeymen, for thus may we translate their French title, are known to have separated themselves in the 12th century from the corporations of master workmen, in consequence of the narrow and oppressive policy of these bodies, making what in modern times would be called a strike, it is reasonable to suppose that they carried with them into their new and independent organization many of the customs, ceremonies, and traditions which they had learned from the main body or masters' guilds of which they were an offshoot. Therefore, although we have not been able to find any legend or tradition of the medieval operative masons which traced their origin to the Temple of Solomon, yet as we find such a tradition prevailing among an association of workmen who, as we know, were at one time identified with the operative masons and seceded from them on a question of policy, we have a reasonable right to believe that the legend of the Compagnons de la Tour, or traveling journeymen, which traced their origin to the Temple of Solomon, was derived by them from the corporations of masters or guilds of operative masons, among whom it was an accepted tradition. Therefore, we have in this way the foundation for a reasonable belief that the legend of the temple origin of Masonry is older than the era of the revival in the beginning of the 18th century, and that it had been a recognized doctrine among the operative Masons of the Middle Ages. The absence of the legend in any formal detail from all the old manuscripts does not prove that there was no such legend. Being of an esoteric character, it may, from conscientious motives, or in obedience to some regulation, never have been committed to writing. This is, however, a mere supposition, and cannot in any way interfere with deductions drawn from positive data in reference to the legend of the third degree. There may have been a temple legend, and yet the details narrated in it may have been very incomplete and not have included the events related in the former legend. The first reference in the old records to the Temple of Solomon, as connected with the origin of Freemasonry, is to be found in the Cook manuscript, and is in the following words: "What time that the children of Israel dwelled in Egypt, they learned the craft of masonry. And afterward they were driven out of Egypt, and come into the land of behest," promise, and is now called Jerusalem. And it was occupied, and charges ye hold, and the making of Solomon's temple that King David began. King David loved well masons, and he gave them right nigh as they be now. And at the making of the temple in Solomon's time, as it is said in the Bible, in the third book of Regum, in Titio Regum Capito Quinto, 1 Kings, chapter 5, that Solomon had 70,000 masons at his work, and the king's son of Tyre was his master mason, and in other chronicles it is said, and in old books of masonry, that Solomon confirmed the charges that David his father had gave to masons, and Solomon himself taught them their manners, customs, but little difference from the manners that now be used. And for thence this worthy science was brought into France and into many other regions. Footnote. Cook manuscript, lines 539 to 575. The Dowland manuscript, whose supposed date is some 50 or 60 years later than the Cook, gives substantially the same legend, but with the additional circumstances that David learned the charges that he gave from Egypt, where they had been made by Euclid, that he added other charges to these, that Solomon sent into various countries for masons, whom he gathered together, that the name of the king of Tyre was Iram, and that of his son, who was Solomon's chief master, was Anon, and finally that he was a master of geometry and of carving and graving. In this brief narrative, the first edition of which dates back as far as the close of the 15th century, we see the germs of the fuller legend which prevails among the craft at the present day, that there was an organization of masons with charges and manners, that is, laws and customs at the building of the Temple of Jerusalem, and that King Solomon was assisted in the work by the king of Tyre, and by a skillful artist who had been sent to him by Hiram, are the two most important points in the theory of the temple origin of Masonry, and both are explicitly stated in these early legends.